we're going to touch a little bit on regulating the industry. Some of those early successes that built the foundation of where we are today in 2020. I think some of the key landmark early decisions, not only by policymakers, but by industry itself, recognizing that they needed that strong foundation in which to operate and to have a sustainable industry in the Commonwealth, to demonstrate to the communities in which they were operating that they were going to do it right, and they were as committed to doing that as the citizens in those communities. And how do we measure progress? That's the topic and the key takeaway, I think, from today's session. What can we point to in 2020? I think there's many things that we can point to, but want to talk a little bit about some of those measurable progress steps that we have achieved to date. So let's jump into it. In the beginning, 2008, 2007, 2008, not a lot of drilling going on, as we all know. We were setting the stage for that here in Pennsylvania, but you've got this new industry, these new players that have come to Pennsylvania. You've got some old players who have been around in Pennsylvania and have been active for many, many years, but they're dipping their toe in this Marcellus Shale. They're testing out some of the resources that they have. They're introducing themselves maybe to some new communities they had not been active in before. So a lot going on at this point in time, really before we saw a lot of heavy drilling and production that was occurring. I looked back to have a baseline from an activity standpoint compared to where we are here in 2020. A quick baseline on that. We've got about 11,000 wells here in Pennsylvania. We're producing north of 6.5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, making us the second largest producer. Well, back then in 2008, we had maybe 400 wells. We produced less than 4% of the natural gas back then as we are today. So really at the infancy in the foundation. But what was going on? Something that was really big in 2008, obviously, was the Great Recession. The housing bubble had burst. Both federal and state governments were looking at significant deficits. Folks were looking for jobs to take care of their families, put food on the table. So the backdrop of Marcellus Shale was really, at a time in hindsight that was fortunate for the Commonwealth, because as the entire country and indeed the world was dealing and reeling with the Great Recession, there was a glimmer of hope, and that glimmer of hope was Marcellus Shale. We saw it start to really manifest itself in a big way here in Pennsylvania when the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources that oversees our state parks and forests put out for lease to see if there was any interest in developing some of our state forest lands with respect to oil and gas. A long history of natural gas development on public lands in Pennsylvania, something that the regulators, the agency was familiar with, many of the players and the operators were familiar with as well. But no one was prepared for the interest that we saw. I have here a reference to the $430 million in bonus payments that was received by the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources over the period of 3 lease sales in 2008 and 2009. To put in context, that's probably 5 to 7 times the total amount that had been generated by the state agency in prior 3 to 4 decades. So it was a number that certainly got their attention, and it got the attention of our elected officials. It got the attention of, at the time, Governor Rendell and our state legislative leaders that wanted to examine if there were future opportunities to also responsibly lease our state forest. And what does that hold for the opportunity for private landowners across Pennsylvania as well? So you saw a significant focus at this time on leasing and acquiring that resource. And then you see the third bullet point here, and let's just throw it out there. A lot of the oxygen was consumed at that time about what state government specifically can do to maximize its revenue potential beyond just the bonus payments and the royalty payments that would come from the activity. And so you saw in the legislature and in the administration a significant focus on talking about a severance tax in Pennsylvania. Came kind of close to enactment. It passed one house in 2010. Couldn't quite get across the finish line from a policy proposal in 2010, but it was certainly front and center. And it was looked at from a few ways. One, parity with other states, ensuring that there's some revenue realized by the taxpayers of Pennsylvania. And again, two, providing the resources to the Commonwealth in light of the Great Recession and the deficits that were being faced by communities across Pennsylvania, to inject some revenue to address some of those shortfalls that we had seen. Some key challenges from the industry side, as well as from the elected official and the policymaker side that I want to talk about. First and foremost, workforce. You know, it wasn't all that long ago, and in some quarters, maybe we still talk about it and chuckle on it every once in a while about the white pickup trucks and the out-of-state license plates. And that's really a harbinger for the conversation happening at this time about what's in it for me, and from a very enlightened self-interest perspective, meaning, are there job opportunities? Are there job opportunities for my children and my grandchildren? Generational opportunities. You know, Pennsylvania has struggled for many years from a brain drain where we educate folks and then they have to go and look elsewhere for gainful employment and to raise their families. So significant focus on workforce. How can we ramp up the education and training opportunities in Pennsylvania so that those who are coming to Pennsylvania or expanding have confidence that those who are doing the work have the skills and the trade and the know-how in which to do what they need to do in what is a very highly technical industry. Impacts on water. You know, we're a water-rich state. We have I think more than any other state in the nation, reliance upon private water wells and groundwater for our drinking water, particularly, of course, in rural areas. We drill more than 20,000 new water wells every single year in Pennsylvania, still do. And if you've got a farm or if you live on, somewhere that does not have public water, your well is your world, meaning if anything goes wrong, you have significant challenges. And so it's important that industry worked at the time to protect groundwater and water supplies and assure both our regulators as well as the communities that their water was in fact going to be protected. A lot of conversation at the time about doing it right. What does that mean? You know, you ask 100 people, you get 100 different answers. A lot of times that conversation dealt with a severance tax and new revenue to the Commonwealth, and any of the ails or concerns that folks had would be addressed if but for a severance tax. Others had very different ideas of that. It meant educating that workforce. It meant raising the bar on environmental standards and performance that was held within the communities in which operators were active. So a lot of conversation on, quote, doing it right, trying to define that so that there were some actionable items for, especially on the elected official side and our policymakers to pursue. And workforce, I throw that in there again just to reiterate the significant importance of that communities were looking for opportunities again, that their local citizens and the generations to come would have opportunities right here, would not have to work and move out of state. Regulating the industry, I want to talk a little bit about some of the key early steps, both by policymakers, but also industry. And really there was a partnership. Industry recognized and put a lot of these challenges and these concerns to be addressed on the radar of regulators as well as elected officials. They recognized that, again, you needed that strong foundation, the confidence not only for the communities, but frankly, their peers around them. There's a recognition within the industry that you are all judged by the least common denominator, and so we need to raise the bar for all. Early on, I'll touch on a few of these, DEP oversight. Oil and gas in 2008 was a small bureau within DEP. They had 64 employees. They mostly dealt with legacy issues from our oil and natural gas drilling and development in northwestern Pennsylvania. Sort of had hummed along for a little while. And then all of a sudden, inundated with applications for drilling, for well pads, for pipelines, impoundments, all the activities that go along with a new and expanding industry. So there was a need to provide the resources there. We saw that early in 2010, again in 2013, and even more recently, where the permitting fees were raised, that revenue driven back to hire additional employees for DEP. Water well protections, we talked about that challenge early on. We saw some concrete action in 2010 and into 2011, finalizing the casing and cementing standards that shale gas wells would need to adhere to. Waterway impacts, I know my colleague Katie Klaber is going to talk a little bit about this in more detail, but this was a critical issue and certainly one that industry put on the radar of regulators, which is concern about discharges into public waterways. A lot of wastewater at the time was taken to publicly owned treatment facilities. There was some concern about the discharges there, and industry needed to look, and so did regulators, at alternate ways in which to handle that wastewater, principally to this day through recycling and reuse of that. The Marcellus Shale Advisory Commission, something I got to be involved with Governor Corbett in 2011. We talk about that doing it right. This was an effort to bring together industry, environmentalists, local government, state agency officials in charge with overseeing this industry to really step back and look at a comprehensive plan on both investment in jobs and training, raising the environmental bar, talking about revenue, whether it was a severance tax or in this case, an impact fee that came out of that, and really having a comprehensive plan and approach from state government on how we're going to maximize the benefits of this shale resource that we're blessed to have, but also ensuring that it's done right, safely, and responsibly. Act 13 was a comprehensive rewrite. A lot of those recommendations flowed not only from the Advisory Commission, but from many legislators on both sides of the aisle, in both the House and the Senate, who had started to introduce individual bills in response to issues that had been raised. So you saw a rewrite of Pennsylvania's Oil and Gas Act, first comprehensive rewrite in over 30 years, stands, I think, as a testament and a foundation to where we are today, but also has been replicated, many of its provisions in other states that have seen shale development. And pipeline safety, in 2011, the legislature passed Act 127, which ensured that our state agencies, specifically our Public Utility Commission, had oversight and regulatory oversight to ensure that pipelines that are regulated at the federal level are done safely and responsibly, particularly those that were being built out in areas of the Commonwealth that had not seen prior development. And finally, some measurable progress. Let's fast forward a little bit. Those 12 years go by pretty fast. There's lots of measurable progress that we can point to. I want to focus on three of them, and principally because a lot of times the conversations around shale, and it frustrates, I'm sure, many of us on this, are more simply limited to local benefits, whether it's jobs or capital investment. And we need to step back sometimes and say that we're all in this together, but we're all benefiting from this as well. So while the bulk of development and production may be occurring in the northern tier in the Northeast or in Southwest Pennsylvania, we're all, as Pennsylvanians, in all 67 of our counties, benefiting. One of the things that's critical to the industry and very proud of is the measurable progress on environmental compliance. You see that there north of 98%. Hard to find an industry that has either a higher environmental compliance rate in Pennsylvania or is under the level of scrutiny as the oil and gas industry is. Over 19,000 inspections just last year, and yet a significant environmental compliance. Again, never satisfied until we get to 100. We can always do better, but let's recognize the bar has been raised. Lower energy prices, everyone pays an electric price, an electric bill in Pennsylvania. Half of us, hopefully more, but half of us have natural gas service in our homes. Many more businesses rely upon it as well, and that's really the opportunity that we have today, is that downstream build out. You can see, we're not talking marginal percentages here. We're talking upwards of 40% in electricity and close to 70% in some quarters on natural gas. This is translating to north of $2,000, $2,500 in savings per household, and magnify that for businesses and manufacturers. So significant benefit to all Pennsylvanians. In cleaner air, we've done all of this development at a time that has seen significant measurable progress with respect to air quality. You see some of those key criteria pollutants and how far they've come just over the last 15 years as natural gas has been an increasing percentage of our generation portfolio. And we're proud as an industry of the contributions. We've got fewer respiratory ailments, hospitalizations, a significant public health benefit derived from the air quality progress that we've made. These are just a few of them. I know we want to continue on into this conversation, so I appreciate the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you. George, I will turn it back over to you.
Well, needless to say, Pat, thank you very much. I appreciate your insights, because I think what's most critical is, and again, you did a nice job of talking about where we are now, but you had that perspective of being in the PA Senate, understanding what the rules were prior to. And I think that's one of the pieces that's really critical. And again, I'm excited for Katie to sort of walk us through as she took on the leadership role of the Marcellus Shale Coalition from its inception to what it is today. It's so interesting because we are constantly hiring employees who don't have a real appreciation for what was. So again, I appreciate you providing us that conversation about what the rules were and how they've evolved. And again, as we have Ms. Klaber give us the opportunity to talk through about what it was like actually making the change and working with regulators and the industry as we came along. I must say, what a time to be a leader of the Marcellus Shale Coalition, Katie. We owe you a debt of gratitude for what you were able to do as an industry to move us forward. So with that said, I'll step down, turn this back over to you. I'm excited to hear your presentation.
Great. Thanks, George. And thanks, Pat. This has been really fun getting ready for today. It took us back to an incredibly busy and I think very impactful time. And Pat, between your Senate role and then when you were in the governor's office, when I was leading the Marcellus Shale Coalition, I can remember that conference room table of yours very clearly, where we spent a lot of time together. So in about 10 minutes, I'd like to try to reflect on this subject of our environmental impact and what we did in those early years that were truly proactive. Yes, there were regulations, but I would say more often than not, we were getting ahead of the regulations as an industry, and that was what the regulators and what elected leaders, we were all pulling in the same direction. I think about it as earning the license to operate in the Northeastern U.S. Northeastern U.S. was how a lot of the companies who had been operating in the Southwest saw us, and it was a very different landscape, both physically and politically, and just the simple density. So we had to look at these things as Pennsylvanians, help the companies that were expanding here and hiring here, help them understand the lay of the land. And I'm just going to share a couple of the proactive measures we took that I think had some of the biggest impact. But obviously this is just a short list. What the industry understood early on, and that the Marcellus Shale Coalition took on, was an approach that really was a best practice, a recommended practice is what we called them. And it served so many purposes. First of all, it got, as new entrants were coming into Pennsylvania, it was a way to get everybody up to speed on what the lay of the land was, physically, politically, and otherwise. So I know I used it in every single board orientation to share, this is what we're working on as an industry group, and you know, this is what we expect of you as a company coming into this organization, into this to this basin. So really had that very important internal purpose. It allowed companies to be working together, not just different E&P companies and pipeline companies, but across the entire supply chain. And that was a great way to get companies that maybe hadn't done a whole lot of work in oil and gas to be really good supply chain members and vendors to our board member companies even more quickly than they would have otherwise. Huge opportunities for partnerships. So one of the first recommended practice that we published was around site planning, development, and restoration. And that allowed us to work with many of the conservation groups who had already looked at what was the best way to restore a site to have the flora and fauna flourish there. That was a really good one to come out with to build some early and strong partnerships. So many of them were, you know, how does this industry best operate within communities? Motor vehicle safety was always top of mind on that. And then we had some very technical, you know, foci of some of these practices, and it allowed so many people throughout our member companies to work with each other on the really important technical issues of the day that were evolving, both in the regulatory arena, in the political arena, and then most importantly to us, you know, within the member companies. So how did that manifest itself? You know, we decided this was really good work internally, but it was important to share it. And as you know, as you can imagine, we weren't always getting the best media attention. So we killed a bunch of birds with one stone here, took out full page ads in the 3 major media markets in the Commonwealth. And every time we were ready to publish one of these practices, we talked about it. We talked about it in some level of technical detail because we believed that, the public deserved to know this detail, and it would help everybody if they did. In tracking the media's treatment of these recommended practices, we were thrilled to see that we got some of the best feedback, most positive or at least neutral review of what we were doing from these recommended practices. So it's something that that really served the industry well, I think, throughout the early years and still today. There are so many other examples. It's hard with the few minutes I have left, but I'm gonna focus on a few of these. Pat had referred to the waterways discharges, and I had done a lot of work before coming to the Marcellus Shale Coalition on the issue of total dissolved solids in Pennsylvania's waterways, which had been a long problem with a lot of sources. But the last thing we wanted to do as a growing industry, and a very visible one, was to be kind of the last discharge in and cause problems that weren't all of our making, but we had the responsibility to not add to a pre-existing problem. So instead of, or in addition to, I should say, going through all of the regulatory issues that are important to get to a place, we cut to the chase, and Secretary Krancer and I had a few very long conversations about how do we get this done quickly and get ahead of this issue. And I was thrilled at the leadership of the board of the Marcellus Shale Coalition when a resolution was put before them very quickly after the conversation with Secretary Krancer. We had a unanimous adoption to say, you know what, we're going to voluntarily eliminate any discharges of salty water, of total dissolved solids that are higher than POTWs were set to effectively treat. And we did that quickly, and we did it ahead of the curve, and frankly, never really got the kind of credit for it that I believe was due. But here, looking back, 10 years, I think it was one of the most impactful ways that the industry, responded to the regulators. The regulators held the industry, to the standard we deserve to be held to. And that was a really excellent way of taking that issue off the table. And I think, no regrets on that whatsoever. Another one, and, like I said, each one of these has an interesting backstory. Chemical disclosure was another very important board resolution. Once we saw that the frac focus database was developed to the point that that we could use it, we took the next step of chemical disclosure. The data was already out there. You could point to, the OSHA, the on-site data for OSHA. You could point to what was submitted to the agency as part of our permit applications, but we knew that frac focus and its full transparency was a really important next step. So another unanimous board decision that said, yes, we will put voluntarily all the chemicals that are used in our work, up onto that database. To this day, it's incredibly detailed, and for people who really do want to understand the chemicals, there is so much there for that information. And again, very proud of taking that particular proactive solution. So proactivity, kind of, one of the most important things that was done in those early years. And I think because of being proactive, you can also think about collaboration. You're not back on your heels. And there was no shortage when you look at the 12.7 million Pennsylvanians at the time, 67 counties, 3,600 municipalities, 501 school districts. I mean, certainly no shortage of stakeholders. And, one of the very important issues was the supply chain. Every one of those supply chain companies was an important collaborator. They shouldn't just be there for the business. They should be there, to help support the industry, do what it needed to do in that heavy lift. So lots of stakeholders. There was never one regret that I had in those early years of reaching out, doing one more presentation. The staff at the MSC, was tireless in the number of outreach and local engagement we did on a daily basis. And I think that also sent the message that these are not people who are looking to hurt the environment. In fact, it's all of our environment, and the more local that we were able to collaborate, I think the more authentic that message was. So lots to talk about. Look forward to the continued engagement here. And thanks again, George and others for including me on this morning.
Not a problem, Ms. Katie. Thank you for joining us today here and providing your insights. And again, I know there are questions already in the chat regarding what was your biggest challenge, how did we get there? I don't want to start that conversation yet because I know that we've got Joe up ahead to talk about sort of where we are today, which really gets to being a leader in this industry. Pennsylvania has come head and shoulders compared to other states, and we've got laws on the books and regulations in place. So again, I'm going to turn this over to Joe to sort of give us the look-see of where we are right today. But from here, we'll be coming back to the panelists, asking them some questions. So Joe, I'm going to give it to you, sir.
Thanks very much, George. It's a pleasure to be here today, folks. I've known Katie and Pat for a long period of time. We've been working with the MSC and its member companies for a long time. And so it's a pleasure to be here and talking about, I think, what we've made in terms of successes and the status of the current oil and gas program. Matt, if I could ask you to go to the first bullet, or the first slide with 3 bullets, there we go. So again, my objective today in the next 10 minutes or so is to briefly describe comprehensive environmental laws that relate to oil and gas development in the Commonwealth. I'm going to be identifying some examples of the stringent regulatory standards, and I'll also be pointing out the multiple layers of regulation that we have here in Pennsylvania. So as you can see on this slide here, there's just a number of laws that I've identified that would relate to oil and gas operations in Pennsylvania. The focus today is going to be on the Oil and Gas Act, Act 13, its regulations. But it's important to note that all of these other acts also have applicability to operators in the Commonwealth. And one other point, when I was actually an attorney for the DER back in the 1980s, counseling the Bureau of Oil and Gas Management, there was a lot less interaction with the different bureaus than there is now. So operators now are dealing with not only the Oil and Gas Bureau, but the Air Quality Bureau, the Clean Streams Group, Dam Safety Group, solid waste folks, and so on and so forth. So it really is becoming something where there's a comprehensive enforcement under all of these laws. Matt, next slide. So with regard to the Act itself, Act 13, I just want to point out some of the examples of the expanded legal protections available under that particular Act. Water management plans are now required under Section 3211. No person may withdraw or use water from any water source in Pennsylvania for the drilling or fracking of an unconventional natural gas well, except in accordance with the DEP-approved water management plan. In order for DEP to approve that, they have to confirm there's not going to be any adverse impact on the quality and quantity of water from the stream it's coming from, and it's not going to be impairing any of the uses. And it also requires a reuse plan for the fluids. Next, we've got setback increases. We've had setback requirements for some time under the Oil and Gas Act, but under the current Oil and Gas Act, Act 13, the setbacks for unconventional gas wells they cannot be drilled within 500 feet, measured horizontally from a vertical well bore to a building or a water well without written landowner consent. And that setback becomes 1,000 feet when you start talking about surface water intakes or water supply extraction points. And so again, we had the concept previously, but it was expanded under Act 13. And then finally, with regard to reporting obligations, there are a host of them. Katie's already mentioned, for example, the frac focus reporting for chemicals used in the stimulation and fracking of wells. There's also new requirements under Act 13 for transportation records, where operators have to record the number of gallons that were used in drilling and stimulating a well, identify where the waste was taken, by whom. There's notices to the DEP with regard to emissions, air emissions, identifying air contaminant emissions from any source that they operate. So again, overall, what we're talking about here are just examples of how the statute itself imposed new standards. As you see here, we've got a few examples of the Oil and Gas Act regulations that also have become more stringent since the time that Pat was talking about at the outset. One example of that is secondary containment. It's now required under the 78A regs that all regulated substances that are generated and managed during drilling and fracking and flowback have to be managed with secondary containment with a certain permeability standard and also have storage capacity for more than the largest volume of the single largest above ground containment structure. The idea being there's going to be something put in place to keep any particular spills from reaching any ground. But we do have also spill reporting and cleanup that's also been increased in terms of its obligations. Those obligations are pretty rigorous as soon as possible, but no later than 2 hours after discovering a spill of more than 5 gallons over a 24-hour period, the operator has to clean it up, depending on whether or not it's less or more than 42 gallons. There are different standards. If you have more than 42 gallons, or you affect a water supply, or excuse me, a water course of any kind, you would have to comply with Pennsylvania's Act 2 standards in terms of the remediation. And there's a host of procedures associated with that. And then finally, as another example, water supply replacement. Pat mentioned water well protections that were available through casing requirements and such, but operators that do nevertheless find that they've affected a water supply have to restore or replace it. And one of the big changes after Act 13 in terms of this particular provision is the statute talks about the restoration, the quality having to be meeting safe drinking water standards, or if the water quality supply exceeded those standards, that particular term has been defined in the regulations to mean that if it was better than safe drinking water standards, then the operator is required to try to restore the water quality to that. Now, what you see in front of you is just a few examples of some of the kinds of permits you have to have, not only the well drilling permit, which I think Pat mentioned, that the fees, those fees for just that permit have recently gone up 150% to $12,500 for just having that particular permit. But on top of that, you have to have your erosion and sedimentation control permit if you have earth disturbance over 5 acres. And from my interaction with people that put those together, they can be a bear to put that together. You have to have it before you disturb earth. Some of the applications can be hundreds of pages long and cost tens of thousands of dollars to get that. And it's not something the DEP issues easily. There's a lot of work involved in getting that. I got references to GP5 and 5A, although admittedly there are a host of general permits that go by GP5 in Pennsylvania. The ones I'm referring to there are the ones that relate to the air quality restrictions associated with both compression stations as well as well sites. And so in other words, it used to be that with the exemptions from the plan approval and operating requirements, it was fairly routine that well sites would not really have to do too much in terms of getting a general permit. The way it is now is that there's a host of things that have to be done in order to be able to document whether or not you have VOC or methane emissions above a certain level, and that you must have leak detection requirements that have to be satisfied in order to be able to operate. I won't go into the others. Chapter 105 deals with the common things you need to get for stream crossings, and OG 71 deals with having to reuse the produced water. Matt, if we go to the next slide. So I mentioned at the outset that we have several layers of regulation. So we've been talking about Pennsylvania DEP, the state, what they require. Of course, there's a host of requirements that would apply in the federal level as well, potentially to the operation of well sites and pipelines. And I've listed a number of them here. One in particular I'd like to note is PHMSA, which is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. PHMSA is the federal agency that is responsible for overseeing pipeline safety. And just as an example of the kinds of things that they do with regard to pipeline safety, over the last year, they've issued a host of new rules that would relate to how operators of pipelines have to proceed to inspect and to report leaks and otherwise do things to ensure the safety of pipelines. One of the ones that I know has gotten a lot of interest is the so-called mega rule. Back in October of not last year, PHMSA issued the first of 3 rules that would relate to federal pipeline safety applicable to natural gas transmission pipelines. And those rules just went into effect in July of this year. They impose new requirements for verifying pipeline materials, for reconfirming what's called maximum allowable operating pressure of certain pipelines. And it also requires periodic assessments of pipeline segments located outside of high consequence areas, including newly defined moderate consequence areas. Phase 2 and Phase 3 of the mega rule was initially expected to occur this year, 2020, but what we have been told is that it's unlikely that's frankly going to happen at this point until after the federal election. Next slide, Matt. So in addition to the federal and state, we've got municipal permitting. And as Katie had mentioned, there's thousands of municipalities in Pennsylvania. Many of them have their own zoning requirements. And so it's possible that you might have to get, if you're an operator, a permit from the local municipality. That might be one that's issued either by right or having to go through a conditional use or a special exception process, which involves a public hearing. At that point, the municipality is able to impose various standards. It is certainly the case that the Oil and Gas Act itself does recognize that it preempts many ordinances, local ordinances that relate to the same features or the same purposes of the act, but particularly after the Robinson Township decision that was issued a few years ago by the Supreme Court, there is a lot of activity on the local level with regard to ordinances. Those ordinances not only purport to regulate operators, but they also authorize, as a matter of right, operations. Those particular ordinances are getting challenged these days by folks that don't want to have oil and gas activities in the area. And so on that level, there's a lot of activity on both sides of the fence. So we've been talking a lot about how we stack up, how we've done over the years with Pennsylvania's program. One way of evaluating that is to look at an independent third-party review. There's an organization called Stronger, State Review of Oil and Natural Gas Environmental Regulations. It was initially created in 1990 by EPA and the Interstate Oil Compact, which established guidelines for how one should regulate oil and gas waste by the member states. Since that time, in the late 90s, it was passed to a nonprofit organization that is a multi-stakeholder organization that expanded on those particular guidelines. Now, Pennsylvania has volunteered to have its program reviewed several times since the 1990s, including 2010, 2013, and 2015. And just as an example of how that process works, in 2013, there was a 10-person review team that included folks like the chief geologist for the Texas Railroad Commission, the director of Earthworks, Oil and Gas Accountability Project, the project director for Trout Unlimited, as well as other official observers, including, for example, in that situation, Delaware Riverkeeper and the Department of Energy's Natural Energy Technology Lab. And so you've got people that are really very intimately involved in that type of regulation, those kinds of programs, closely reviewing the Pennsylvania program. And the way that they interviewed it is that they interviewed a dozen people that were knowledgeable folks in DEP, including the deputy director of DEP's Oil and Gas Bureau, Scott Perry, and questionnaires were completed. And it was a very thorough process. We had some people from our firm actually attending the hearings that were occurred in Harrisburg, in which there was a lot of input provided to the program. And if we could look at the next slide, Matt. We talked about, Pat mentioned, have we made progress? Well, these are the conclusions that were drawn by Stronger. In 2010, after evaluating DEP's hydraulic fracking program, they concluded that it was commended because of the fact that the department had done so much in terms of trying to prevent problems. That included tracking water withdrawals under the Water Resources Act, baseline water quality testing like pre-drill samples, identifying, tracking waste that would be generated through Form 26R, and essentially encouraging source reduction and recycling. In 2013, DEP's program to evaluate radiation levels associated with unconventional gas was evaluated. It was found that DEP had basically had the first of its kind program that evaluated very closely the type of radioactivity levels found in various materials associated with unconventional natural gas. And that data showed, for example, that less than 0.5% of drill cuttings that were disposed in Pennsylvania's landfill triggered radiation monitors. And they also determined that the cuttings did not contain levels of radioactivity that would be considered harmful to the public. And then more recently, in 2015, Stronger evaluated the Air Quality Bureau as it relates to Pennsylvania's oil and gas program. One of the things that they noted is that Pennsylvania was the first state to implement leak detection and repair requirements as part of the permitting process, standardized permitting process for oil and gas wells. And I'll note that for each of these reports, the Stronger Committee determined that Pennsylvania's program was well-managed, professional, and meeting its program objectives. So again, I think we can determine that in addition to looking at the progress that Pat had pointed out with regard to environmental compliance, cleaner air, and so on and so forth, you're finding third-party organizations evaluating it and also giving it high marks. So those are my remarks. I'd be happy to participate in any question and answer. George, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. I appreciate your insights. And I think, what we really need to remember is when you think about where we were, and I've got a question for Mr. Henderson regarding the earlier struggle that he faced, but where we've come to in 2020 is you've got an organization like Stronger looking at our regulations, but if I'm not mistaken, you even know of other states that'll look to Pennsylvania to say, we need to sort of we need to regulate and legislate like they do. Am I correct in that we're a sort of a premier leader, if you would?
Well, George, I'll jump in on that, and Joe can build on it. You're absolutely right, and I think we've all spent some time. I know many of the panelists here, and I'm sure many of our guests today as well, talking with those out-of-state folks. They've come here to Pennsylvania on fact-finding missions and tours. They want to see what it's like out there in the field. They've talked to our regulators, elected officials. We've seen not only from other states, but indeed other nations as well. So I think it's absolutely fair to say that Pennsylvania has been, sort of set the baseline for that, and has been helping to raise the bar in a lot of jurisdictions around the country and indeed around the world on that.
I appreciate you jumping in because, again, I know that we've hosted at Cabot, we've hosted other states, delegations, and we've also hosted other nations and their delegations to understand what it is we're going. So we've got to unmute Joe at some point, but I'm going to stay with you, Pat, since you are unmuted. The question that came in was, if you would talk about what was your earliest, biggest hurdle. And again, go back to, maybe when you were in the state Senate transitioning to Corbett. What at that time frame was your biggest hurdle in the eyes of the elected officials?
Well, I think it was trying to stay ahead of the narrative that others were trying to define a bit. And what I mean by that is, early on there were glimpses of potential and benefits, from economics and revenue to energy security to cleaner air. We started to see that. We wanted to see it realized, but we started to see that. But even then, we still lived in a 24/7 news cycle. And, folks were acquiring information, being elected officials, their constituents who were contacting them. I read this online, I read that. This must be happening. And I think trying to stay ahead of that, to say, well, we're catching our breath here, but as we catch our breath, we're continuing to walk forward because this is a good thing. And we want to make sure that we do, in fact, do it right and attract investment and let folks know Pennsylvania is open for business here with respect to shale development. But it's difficult to try and to capture in the time we have the misconceptions. Some of them genuine, not all of them intended to intentionally mislead. Folks have legitimate questions about the activity that they're seeing. So you want to serve as a resource to them so they can make informed decisions, about their own family situation, perhaps if they're contemplating leasing, or to elected officials. You also want to stay ahead of and try and correct and redirect a bit the narrative that may be, creating misperceptions about the industry and its activities. I
appreciate your insights there, Pat. Now, Katie, this is a tough one for you. It comes in and the question asked is, what do you think in the time you were heading the MSC was your biggest accomplishment? And again, I don't know if you can single that down to one. I know there are many things that you did, but the question was, what do you think your biggest accomplishment looking back as you led the MSC?
Well, internally by far, George, and that had ramifications externally, it was getting 35 board members to all pool those oars in the same direction, because, there's this misnomer, and we've all heard it, the industry, right? The industry thinks this, or the industry does this, or should do that. And we know that the companies are as diverse and have, different structures, whether they're publicly traded, vertically integrated, privately run, where they are geographically, what their culture is. And I think it was so helpful when the industry members and, the MSC board table, 95+% of the gas being produced was in Pennsylvania was coming from those members. If everybody could agree that this was a priority, then we can move mountains. The challenge was, and Pat made it clear, there was so much going on at that time One of the strategic planning sessions we did early in one of those first years that I was facilitating, we came up with 36 priorities. So you can imagine the process to take 36 and get down to, all right, what are we trying to achieve? That in itself, maybe it's a philosophical response to your question, but really getting everybody on the same page and recognizing that we were not going to be successful if we were at counter purposes as the industry. And, we had to work alongside our friends in coal. We had to work alongside, a whole lot of different industries that were probably, not quite aware of what was going on at the point we were at that time. So I hope that addresses the question.
I think it does, and I think it does, and I think again you brought to the fore the idea that it was incumbent upon us, like it is to show off our operations, whether it's to other operators, to other states, to other nations. It really became important for you and the MSC early on to work hand in glove with the regulators. Right. And again, that's a positive when you're showing them. I mean, one of the questions that's coming in on the Q&A that I'm going to address, but I'm going to turn it over to you and or Pat, is, when you talk about the industry coming here, how did you learn from other states? And were there things that you chose not to do in Pennsylvania? I raised my hand early on because one of the things that Cabot moved to quickly was eliminating the impoundments. We all quickly moved to a closed loop system. It made sense. It rains 42 inches a year in Susquehanna County. I'm creating a hole in the ground to capture rainwater. Bad idea. But again, in an arid climate, that made sense. Those were the kind of things that we as operators saw, whereas a regulator might look on the books and say, we need to copy that. No. In Pennsylvania, you don't, because you create a bigger problem. So we definitely had an opinion as operators, and we would come together at the MSC and say, we need to move quickly to a new standard. So Katie, as I talk about that new standard, does that sort of ring any bells for you in that sense of things that you were pushing that were new and different from the industry standpoint?
Well, benchmarking, I go if it already exists, we should adopt it. But I must say, one of the first outreach I did was to API and said, hey, we got to pull some standards together for these things. The problem was it wasn't customized enough to what was the urgent issues. 36 urgent issues, right? I do believe that we took the best by the fact that operators were involved in those early regulatory and, all those committees that were operating to raise the bar. They were inherently bringing the best practices from what company or region they'd operated in before. But let's face it, a lot of what we needed to do was cutting edge because there had not been this scale of development in an area that was as populated, that had the very unique geography. I remember one of my favorite board members was looking at how the Marcellus, there were certain things we could do to learn from the Barnett. And, it was a great idea. And he had his, his gentleman out of DC on the phone. And I said to them, this is great, but you were talking about about 500 square miles? And he said, oh, yeah. And we achieved X, Y, and Z. I said, this is 95,000 square miles. So the scale of what we had to cover with multiple states, I think, was also unique, and not a single square inch of unincorporated territory here. That was not the case in any of the basins that our operators were looking to for comparisons. And that brought on, as Pat and Joe recall well, an entirely new set of issues when every square inch is incorporated territory. So.
Understood. Pat, I don't want to hold you off there. I don't know if you had a piece to add to that, sir.
Yeah, briefly, the water is, I think, front and center. And George, it rains in Susquehanna County, it rains across Pennsylvania. So the recognition that Pennsylvania is very different. We're lush and we're green. We could use some rain now, but generally compared to where some of these operators were coming from, we're not dry, we're not flat. Cross the line from Lycoming into Tioga County and certainly southwestern Pennsylvania. A lot of hills that raises issues such as erosion and sediment control that Joe outlined with respect to some of the permitting. So different animal and a different game there with respect to how you use water. That was, I think, a significant issue. And I would build on what Katie said there with respect to priorities and those 36 priorities and how do you make them actionable and reasonable. We have to be mindful as well, and it's true to this date, but it was particularly true then. Industry is not the only one coming up with priorities that you've got to respond to. You've got regulators who are trying to scramble and figure out what they need. You have policymakers. And then you have local communities and even environmental organizations. They have a whole slew of them. And so how do you build some consensus? And we've seen examples of that, but build consensus to get buy-in from as many of those parties as you can so that you can accomplish something, get it across the finish line. And now, here 10 years later, we can look back and say, yeah, it worked, and we can be proud of that effort.
Well, Pat, funny you're saying that because, one of the questions that's coming in is, because of your experience of being there at the beginning to today, it's, what do you see that's that ongoing challenge today? And how do you today at the MSC look at new elected officials? What are the first couple things you explain to them about our industry today?
Yeah, it's a reminder. You look at the elected officials in our state legislature, and it's true at the local level as well. Significant turnover. So some of the battles and the accomplishments that we can all point to 10, 12 years ago, the recipe that went into trying to get that product, they weren't familiar with it. They weren't part of that, and that's understandable. And so we have to constantly educate and do it in a way that's credible, that they can have confidence to say, yeah, we had this conversation, this is where we settled, and this is how it's played out over those years. That will never go away. But it's particularly pronounced today because we have seen in the last several election cycles significant turnover. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to educate, to reinforce the benefits, but it's also an obligation to ensure that they're informed, so when they're talking to their constituents who stop them at the supermarket, that they can credibly speak to the issue with confidence.
And for you, Joe, it's not a question, it's a comment, but the comments coming in with the idea that, again, people are grateful that firms like Babst Calland are taking a look to see where we were in 10, comparing it to 11, comparing it to 12, and sort of categorizing and cataloging where we've been, what's new, and what has to happen ahead. If I'm not mistaken, you guys actually have an update you prepare once a year that's similar to that, correct?
Yeah, that's right, George. We put together a white paper, as we call it. Actually,
be careful.
I think it is.
I want those books followed.
I know. It's a fairly, I'd say, heavy-duty document we put together. Been doing this for 10 years. We find that friends of the firm clients really appreciate us doing this because we kind of look soup to nuts with, what the program is in Pennsylvania, what the DEP is doing, what the local municipalities are doing, what case law is developing as it relates to, title and, basically all the different facets of the operation. So this is something that we also provide to people if they are interested in getting it. And we found that a lot of the clients, even those in, might have their offices in Texas, look for it because of the fact that it takes a lot of effort to try to put this stuff into some context. Katie has been kind enough to help us with these things and providing the operator business perspective. But yeah, we've enjoyed doing it. It's taken a lot of work and we don't get paid for it, but we think it's something that's valuable because we think it helps to keep people educated, just like your show.
Well, it's obvious that folks are aware of it and they're appreciative of it because, again, at the outset of today, it all goes back to the new employees that we hire at Cabot. They're not familiar with what 08 was like or what 10 was like. they look at closed loop systems and that's what they know. We have to sort of remind people of what it was like, how far we've come, because I believe wholeheartedly that we have made tremendous strides as an industry, things that we should be proud of, that we have to constantly put out there, because as Pat said, it's difficult at times to constantly be educating, but we have to do it because otherwise we look like we're not moving forward. So we're beyond the 1 o'clock hour. I don't know if Pat or Katie, you have any closing comments you want to. I'll give you that opportunity, and then I'll end it with my own closer.
I'd just say, George, thank you to Cabot and the other sponsors and to your team that hosts this Think About Energy. There is, I think we can all get complacent when we were, running like crazy 10 years ago and think, oh, now everybody understands shale development in, Pennsylvania and surrounding states. But you're right, there are new people coming in all the time, and kudos to running this program. You and Cabot are really taking a leadership role there.
Well, thank you for that. Mr. Henderson?
Yeah, I too want to say thank you very much, George, for the invitation, those who were able to join today. It's important, as this program says, to think about energy, to pause and not just simply, give a reaction, but really think about it. And that's what your forum has enabled us to do. So I'm appreciative. And to the point that you just raised, George, about a lot of promises were made by industry early on, but time needed to pass for those to play out. And I think that we can look back with pride in 2020 to a lot of promises kept and the track record that we've seen over the last 10, 12 years. And I think that just bolsters us going forward, that there's some credibility there and integrity on the industry side as we look to build future opportunities. So appreciate the forum and the invitation.
Well, I'm going to close with two things. Number one, I appreciate you taking the time out to join us on the forum. Having your expertise is needed. We are working for our next one. The date has already been established. It will be September 24th. We'll have our next Think About Energy, and it'll feature Jeff Catula from the Washington County Chamber, Jason Fink from the Williamsport-Lycoming Chamber, and Commissioner Alan Hall from Susquehanna County. They'll provide their insights as to how the last decade has gone from their view. But before that, again, that date will be the 24th of September. Before that, the Shale Energy Alliance will be having another Twitch meeting set for the 16th of September. And again, they do theirs at a 5 o'clock hour. And as a participant, I enjoy being on them. It's good, again, to share information. So again, they have a rally set for the 16th. Information is available, but again, it's very similar. It's sharing information like this, making certain that our friends and colleagues aren't unaware of the progress that we have made, because at the end of the day, people are thinking about energy. It is being discussed at the national level with both conventions taking place last week and this week. We are front and center, and we need to be doing our best to educate our peers, our supporters, and that neutral middle that really needs to have a better appreciation for how far we have come along. So with that said, 2 events in September. Joe, Pat, Katie, thank you. And I have to hand it off to the other Henderson. And there's a lot of conversation in the chat right now about the 2 Hendersons, but I'm not going to go there. So Matt, take us home, sir.
Thanks, George, and I appreciate everybody. As George mentioned, there's some great events coming up. Look for an email here within the next day. We will send that to you via email, and hopefully you can attend those Think About events and the Shale Energy Alliance event. So on behalf of the Think About Energy team, thank you everybody for attending, and have a safe day. Thank you.